He smoked, drank, laughed, and still became one of the most influential spiritual thinkers of the 20th century. He questioned religion, simplified Eastern philosophy, and embraced his flaws.
Those higher critics at that time just assumed that the simple teachings of Jesus could not possibly have included any such complicated mystical theology.
Something most spiritual teachers wouldn't dare to do. Critics even called him a fraud.
The question comes from the order of words. The answer comes from the order of nature, from Li.
But decades after his death, his ideas still inspire millions. In this video, we'll uncover the life, controversies, and impact of Alan Watts. But before we talk about whether there could be another spiritual rebel like Alan Watts, let's first get to know why he was so different. Who was Alan Watts? Alan Watts wasn't just a thinker. He was a disruptor who redefined spirituality for an entire generation.
We were talking last time about the extraordinary conflict between man and nature which exists among almost all highly civilized peoples.
But who was the man brave enough to challenge both East and West and inspire millions to see life differently? Alan Watts was born in England in 1915 and grew up surrounded by two very different worlds. On one side, there was the rigid structure of Western Christianity. On the other, he was drawn to the mysteries of Eastern philosophies, which offered a more flexible, almost playful way of understanding life. It was this blend of curiosity and rebellion that would define his entire career. From a young age, Watts stood out. By his early 20s, Watts began challenging the Christian doctrines he was raised with. Ordained as an Anglican priest in his mid-20s, he used his position not to uphold the church's teachings, but to question their foundation. In one sermon, he challenged the church's authority, saying its strict rules and structure held back true spiritual growth. He believed real enlightenment couldn't come from dogma or confined to scripture-rigid beliefs. Some people in his congregation were so upset they wanted him removed, calling him a heretic. Others quietly admired his courage. In the end, the growing tension was too much, and Watts left the priesthood. At that time, he was devouring books on Zen Buddhism, Hinduism, and Taoism, topics that were almost unheard of in England at the time. But what made him different was his ability to see the flaws in both the East and the West. Watts didn't believe either side had all the answers. Instead, he wanted to build a bridge between them. When Alan Watts moved to the United States in the 1940s, his rebellious nature only grew. He became a strong critic of the Western focus on materialism and conformity, often giving sharp lectures that condemned the rat race lifestyle. But it wasn't just his words that caused a stir, it was his actions too. Watts openly experimented with psychedelics like LSD and mescaline at a time when they were illegal and seen as immoral. He wrote openly about how these experiences broke down his ego and helped him see new layers of reality. Many spiritual leaders criticized him, saying he was taking shortcuts to enlightenment and ruining the purity of spiritual growth. Even some of his followers struggled to accept his drug use alongside his teachings. But Watts didn't back down. He believed the journey to truth didn't have to follow traditional rules and was willing to explore every path that could get him there.
But what will other people say? Am I being consistent? Does what I do make any sense?
Through his books, like The Way of Zen and the book on the taboo against knowing who you are, Watts reached millions. He was reshaping how people thought about life. He gave them permission to stop searching for meaning outside themselves and start experiencing life in the moment. But that does not explain what actually made him a spiritual rebel. What made Alan Watts a spiritual rebel? Alan Watts didn't just follow spiritual traditions. He tore them apart, questioned their purpose, and put them back together in a way no one had ever seen before. Watts' rebellion wasn't just about leaving the church or rejecting organized religion. It was about breaking down rigid systems of belief. One of his most daring moves was reinterpreting Zen. While traditional Zen affirmed long hours of meditation, Zazen, Watts dismissed this as unnecessary. He famously joked, "A cat sits until it's tired of sitting, then gets up, stretches, and walks away." He criticized the Western obsession with endless meditation, calling out even devout practitioners for overcomplicating Zen's essence. His views shocked traditional Zen circles, whereas the Zen was considered sacred. For some, his dismissal of it seemed almost heretical, but Watts wasn't being careless. He wanted to strip Zen of its heavy rituals and focus on its core, a way of being rather than constant doing.
Just sitting like that. You may say, oh, that's a great waste of time. There are all sorts of interesting things in life to do. Why just spend some hours sitting? And the reason, though, as I tried to explain, is that it is through this that one comes to have a contact.
But it wasn't just Zen that Watts dismantled. He went after the popular Western interpretation of karma and reincarnation, two concepts often romanticized by seekers of Eastern wisdom. Watts rejected the idea of karma as a cosmic justice system of rewards and punishments. He believed this interpretation was a misreading, turning a profound concept into little more than a moral ledger.
The real meaning of karma, the word in Sanskrit means simply doing. And if I say of an event it is your karma, it is saying it is your doing.
Similarly, he saw reincarnation not as a literal cycle of lives, but as a metaphor for the constant rebirths within one's existence, the death of old selves and the emergence of new ones. These interpretations enraged purists, who saw him as a dilettante, cherry-picking ideas to fit his narrative. But Watts stood firm. He believed that these spiritual concepts had been corrupted, warped into tools for control rather than liberation. His rebellion wasn't just intellectual, it was personal, a fight for the freedom to think, live, and teach authentically. But Watts' most controversial rebellion came in his critique of spiritual gurus and the commercialization of spirituality. He despised the way spiritual practices were being commodified in the West, with self-proclaimed teachers selling enlightenment like a product. Watts called these gurus frauds who exploited vulnerable seekers for profit, even as he profited from selling his own books and lectures. This apparent contradiction made him a polarizing figure, with some accusing him of the very hypocrisy he condemned. He wasn't afraid to challenge authority, whether it was the church, academic scholars, or even Zen masters. He believed no one had all the answers, not him, not religious leaders, and not spiritual traditions. He even criticized his followers, urging them not to rely on him for guidance. He said, "If you meet the Buddha, kill him." This made him both admired and criticized. Some loved him for his honesty and openness, while others thought he was disrespectful. Alan Watts was a rebel who shattered the old rules and redefined what it means to live authentically. He proved that spirituality isn't about perfection or conformity. It's about embracing life with all its flaws and living it to the fullest.
And as is well said, variety is the spice of life.
But his views brew a ton of problems for him. Controversies and criticism. Alan Watts was called a hypocrite, a sellout, and even a spiritual fraud. But was he misunderstood, or was he exactly what he claimed to be? One of the most talked about controversies was his personal life. Watts was married 3 times and had 7 children, but his relationships were marked by turbulence, including his first marriage, to Eleanor Everett, which ended during his time as an Episcopal priest. His second marriage to Dorothy DeWitt, with whom he had 5 children, dissolved amidst infidelity and his struggles with alcoholism. By the time Watts married his third wife, Mary Jane Yates King, in 1964, his reputation for being a free-spirited yet unreliable partner was well established. Mary Jane, known as Jano in her circle, became his companion during the latter years of his life. Their relationship was marked by his bouts of alcoholism and erratic behavior. Critics often saw these personal challenges as inconsistent with the spiritual ideals he promoted in his teachings. Also, Eastern spiritual teachers, particularly those steeped in Zen traditions, were some of Watts' harness critics. Roshi Philip Kapleau and others accused him of misinterpreting key Zen concepts, such as the role of meditation and the nature of enlightenment. D.T. Suzuki, a towering figure in Zen Buddhism, reportedly expressed disappointment in Watts' understanding of Zen, stating that he did not grasp the deeper essence of the practice. One of the most infamous critiques came from Western Zen practitioners, who saw Watts as a philosophical entertainer rather than a serious student of Zen. While some admired his ability to make Eastern ideas accessible, others viewed him as a shallow interpreter who oversimplified profound concepts for a Western audience. One of the most persistent controversies surrounding Watts was his struggle with alcohol. By the 1960s, his drinking had escalated to the point where friends and family feared it would destroy him. His habit of consuming up to a liter of gin a day was no secret, and while his supporters framed it as part of his rebel mystique, detractors saw it as a glaring hypocrisy. How could a man who spoke so eloquently about balance and mindfulness succumb to such self-destructive behavior? Watts himself was aware of the contradiction. He often laughed off concerns about his drinking, once joking that it was part of his method of exploring the human experience. But as his health deteriorated in the early 1970s, the darker side of his indulgence became harder to ignore. His death in 1973, widely attributed to alcoholism, left a lingering question. Could a man so insightful about life have been blind to his own demise? But Alan Watts didn't shy away from controversy. He openly acknowledged his flaws, from his turbulent relationships to his struggles with alcohol, even weaving these realities into his lectures. His candidness made him relatable, breaking the illusion of perfection often associated with spiritual leaders. Despite the criticisms, Alan Watts' message continues to match. A spiritual rebel wouldn't take sides. They'd remind us that we're all human, all trying to figure things out, and that compassion and understanding are more important than ever. And maybe, just maybe, another spiritual rebel is already on the horizon. Do you think the world is ready for another spiritual rebel like Alan Watts? Or do we need something entirely different? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Before you go, don't forget to check out my recent video.